Hi there, and thank you for attending this virtual session on a developer's guide to SCIM. If you'd like to follow along, all the slides that I'm going to be presenting from are available on the URL that you see here on the screen. You can go to bit.ly/scim-guide to see all the slides that I'm presenting from. Here's the agenda for today. I'll be talking about myself, including some of my background on SCIM. I'm going to give an introduction to SCIM for those of you who aren't familiar with it. I'll be talking about why you might want to implement SCIM, and then assuming that I'm convincing enough, and you want to implement it, I'm going to cover some of the things that you're going to want to keep in mind as you implement SCIM or before you get started. Then I'm going to give you a demonstration of implementing SCIM. And then finally, I'll close with some resources that you can use to learn more about SCIM, as well as some hints as to what's coming next in the world of standards. Now, a word about this slide. You'll notice that I've got these different color schemes here. This is to help you keep track of which part of the talk you're in. And so you'll notice on the left-hand side, as I progress through the talk, you'll be able to kind of have a guide as to where we are. So as you see here, we're in the About Me section, and as I make a progress through this, the colors will change on the background of the slide. All right, so here's a picture of me when I'm dressed up like a 60s programmer, because I had a chance to write some software for the IBM 1401, which is there behind me. Well, that's the tape reader for it, actually. Anyway, my name's Joël Franusic. I'm a group developer advocate for Okta, where I focus on Python and Go. There's plenty of ways to get a hold of me online. I'm on GitHub, where my username is JPF. You can also find me on Twitter, where my username is JF. You can also email me at the address that you see there at the bottom of the screen. Now, in terms of my background, you might be wondering, why should you have to listen to this Joël person talk about SCIM? And while I'll be the first to admit that I'm by no means a SCIM expert, I have spent a lot of time implementing SCIM, reading the standard, helping customers who are implementing SCIM with their implementations. So in terms of my background, summary is that I was the one who ran the beta program when Okta first launched the SCIM client, or the SCIM cloud client, which is where Okta will go and make a connection to a service that supports SCIM as a server. And as part of running that beta, I wrote what was the original version of the SCIM documentations, the first draft of the SCIM documentation. I also wrote a sample SCIM server, and then wrote the run scope tests that were used as the basis for the tests that are now used by our team to validate integrations before they are added to the Okta integration network. I've also been part of 2 talks at previous Octanes. One of the talks I gave was on lifecycle management and the various ways that you can do that. So if you aren't familiar with lifecycle management, it's basically just the process of dealing with the user from the time that they join an organization, that they move around or have updates inside of the organization, and then when they leave, and all the different ways of handling all those different changes. And so Okta has a bunch of different ways of doing lifecycle management. Among them are SCIM. So I gave a talk about those different options and mainly focused on SCIM. The following year, I was part of a talk that my coworker Sarah Dakik gave, which was a talk called The Power of SCIM, where she covered at a high level all of the bits of SCIM that are interesting. It was still new at the time, so there were a lot of people that weren't very familiar with it, so she did a great job at that talk giving an overview. And then she had me and one of the Okta's partners or customers, I forget which, who was helping talk about what he'd been doing as a person outside of Okta who was also implementing SCIM. So I actually think that talk, The Power of SCIM, pairs pretty well with the one that you're watching now. Now let's go over a brief introduction to SCIM. So given the title of this talk, I'm assuming that you're a software developer or understand how to look at code, or have experience writing code or using it. And given that type of background, it's pretty easy to understand what SCIM is. It's just a RESTful API for managing users and groups. Now, that sounds a little bit abstract, so I just wanted to give an example of what that might look like with a more concrete example. So let's imagine that we are working on a API for a parts store, a store that sells auto parts. So you can imagine a auto parts service would have things like a parts endpoint, which would list all the various parts that were available, and then an orders endpoint where you could put in an order for various parts, get a price for it, get charged for it, so that you can then take those parts and go put them into your car. Now, it makes sense that you would also have to have some additional endpoints. One for users, because people are the ones that go in and purchase those parts. It's not just robots or computers or cars that are driving themselves to the store to order themselves parts, at least not yet. And then there are groups that you'd want to put those users into. And so some groups might be a customer group for people that are registered as customers, for employees, maybe people that have special access to edit orders, to look at previous orders, and then maybe a vendors group. So for somebody who might be selling the belts or the hoses or the bolts or the tools, they could actually keep their inventory list up to date. They could add and change parts and information on those parts, but wouldn't be able to look at orders or look at users or anything like that. Well, in this imaginary example, those last two endpoints would be SCIM endpoints. So SCIM defines a user's endpoint and a group's endpoint. There's a few others, but those are the two main ones. And that's the main part of SCIM. Well, it's not the main part. There's also payloads. So of course, if you spend any time around APIs, you know that you have the endpoints and you have the payloads, you've got other stuff, but those are the main things that you think about. So you might be wondering, well, what does the payload look like? Well, I can tell you that it's JSON, thankfully. I have spent a lot of time with XML. Very little of that time was enjoyable, but every time I've worked with JSON, it's been a pleasant experience, especially compared to XML. So anyway, here's what it looks like. You've got a schema part here, which defines what you might want to expect to see in a payload. Then you've got all kinds of common sense stuff. You've got meta information about when the user was created, modified, the canonical URL for that user object, and so forth. You've got the name of the user, both the fully formatted name as well as their last name and first name. Then you've got things like their phone number, their email address, and then up here you've got their ID, which is how this system would label that, which in this case it's a UUID. I'll explain why you shouldn't use UUIDs and use XIDs instead. I'll cover that soon. But there's also a thing called an external ID. So the system that sent this user over also had their own identifier for the user, and it's helpful to store that as well, and that's part of the SCIM standard. Of course, you don't need to memorize that or take a screenshot of that slide. Anything that you're going to want to learn about SCIM is available on the SCIM website. It's not a very obvious kind of URL. In fact, it looked a little weird the first time I saw it. I wondered if it was like a spam site or something, but it's simplecloud.info. That's the actual URL for it, and it's a great resource. They have all the specifications, all the things that you would need to get an in-depth understanding of how SCIM actually works under the hood. So definitely recommend checking that out. Now, in terms of SCIM and why should you use SCIM? So let's get into that. Now, I think the main reason why I like SCIM and why I'm a bit of a fan is that I've used dozens of APIs over my time, not only just at Okta, but I've also worked at Twilio and also at Microsoft, and in all those roles, I used internal and external APIs for all those companies, as well as various different APIs from different companies on the internet. SCIM's among the better ones. It just makes sense. Everything that you expect to be there is there. It doesn't have features that you don't need. It just does what it's supposed to do, and it does a good job at it. Furthermore, talking about doing just what it needs, it's a really well-designed spec. It does what you'd want. It doesn't really do anything beyond that. It's simple, and it's easy to understand. It doesn't have all these exceptions and features that you're not gonna care about. The downside of that, though, is that it doesn't meet everybody's needs. Of course, if you've got really specific needs, especially around authorization, like fine-grained authorization, something like saying if you want to be able to say this user can only edit this particular cell on this particular spreadsheet, SCIM doesn't work well for that. But that doesn't actually bother me, because SCIM's meant to synchronize information between different identity systems, and no two identity systems model authorization in the same way. So it makes sense that keeping groups as the main way of modeling authorization is what you'd have in SCIM. And in my experience anyway, anything that's more complicated than that, it's usually best to actually just have your own user interface for your own fine-grained authorization. But otherwise, most places can do fine just by saying, have a coarse-grained authorization model saying people in the employees group can only do things that employees should do, people in the vendors group should only be able to do things that vendors can do. The number here on the screen, the 90% of use cases, not scientific by any means, there's no research backing that up. But that's kind of just rough guess based on my personal experience. Most of the time, SCIM does what people would expect it needed to do. And then finally, the last option, or the last reason why you should use SCIM is why most people use it, and that it's just a great way of integrating with other services. So if you're going to be wanting to have other services give you user information, keep that user information up to date, there's no better way than using SCIM. There's no other way that I know of. I mean, there might be some other standards, but SCIM is nice enough, clean enough that that's just what I'd recommend. Now, this might all be hard to imagine. Maybe you're falling asleep. It's kind of boring. So let's break it up. Let's have a demo here showing you what it would actually look like to see SCIM in action. So what I've got here, and where I'm going to be getting set up here, is 3 different windows. And these windows are, here on the upper left is Okta. And this is a application which is SCIM enabled. Down beneath it, we've got a tool called ngrok, which is allowing Okta to communicate to my local machine. So anything that goes to this URL that you see here will be sent to localhost 9090, which is this service over here. So you can see localhost 9090. This is just an example SCIM service that has users and updates as the users are added or removed to the service. You might be wondering why there's 3 users here and only 2 users on the Okta side. The simple explanation for that is that this test user was added directly here, and when I set up this integration, I just didn't have Okta synchronize users over from my other service. I just had it provision users itself. So the way it's set up, you'll usually go into a provisioning tab, you'll turn on provisioning. You'll go in and edit the SCIM connection. You'll notice that this URL here will map to this URL here. It's got to be a public URL, which is why I'm using ngrok. And then once that's set up, you can do some basic testing, make sure it all works. Then you can go over here and go to your assignments. Now, if you're an Okta admin, you probably know that most of the time assignments are managed by groups. Whenever someone's added to a group, they'll be assigned a particular application. At least that's the preferred way of doing it. But in this case, I'm going to be assigning it to some people. So you'll see here I have a bunch of very creative test users. I want to add in a user I've never added in before. So let's add in Alice testing. I didn't want to look at that user. I wanted to assign that user. So let's go here again. Let's scroll down, say show more. Let's go over, find Alice testing and click assign. There we go. We have a chance to tweak anything that we might see here. And then as soon as I added Alice, she gets added over to the system that you see over there. And furthermore, you can see the SCIM API calls that were made. So there was a get and a post. So another cool thing about ngrok is you'll see it has this web interface here running in port 4040. And if I go in here, I can see actually what it is that that was done. So the API request was calling the user endpoint with a filter saying, I only want to see users where the username equals alice@example.com. And my SCIM server responded with a 200 OK, which meant it was a successful query, but there were no results. So nothing came back. And because of that, Okta knew, oh, okay, this is a brand new user. I need to add this new user. And so it sent over this familiar looking payload here. Another thing that you'll notice is it's saying the identifier I use, meaning the identifier that Okta uses to refer to this user is this. And if you don't know this already, every identifier inside of Okta, whether it's a user ID or a group ID or an application ID or a filter ID, all of those identifiers all have a unique prefix. So in the case of users, it's 00U. And you can see this by going into any user and looking at that user's profile. So if I open up Alice testing, you'll see it's 00U 2WP9. Here it's 2WP9, so you can verify it's the same user. What's useful knowing this is if you see a user ID and you want to know who it is, you can copy that user ID, go to any other user, and just replace the user ID in their URL with your own, with the user ID in question, and you can see who that user is. You might also wonder what this deal is here with this password. This actually is not Alice's password. By default, when Okta pushes a password to a downstream service, it just makes up a random password. And so this is done just to prevent passwords leaking to places that they shouldn't leak. You can disable this too, but by default it's on, and so that's just why it's on there. Let's show you the rest of how this works. So now we can go in here and let's say we want to unassign a user. So let's take off Bob Robertson. So I'm going to go here and unassign that user. You see Bob goes away. You'll see here that down in EndRock that we've got this user being fetched and then a put. Now, if you're familiar with REST APIs, you might be wondering, why is that a put? Why is it not a delete? Well, I'll show you. So if we go back over here and look at this put request, you'll see that it says active equals false, or set the active status to false. So what's happening here is this user is being deactivated. It's not actually being deleted, just being set to inactive. And that's the default for Okta. So we do that because we found that most of the time you want to keep a user account around, whether it's for auditing purposes, or maybe it's just because people tend to come and go from services. And so it's best just to keep them lying around. You can see this particular user is probably only a few dozen bytes in a database, not going to take up a ton of space, but you can change it so that a user delete happens as well, but that's the default, and that's why we do it. All right, so with that, we can continue on, and let's go here and go back to our demo. So we talked about why you would want to use SCIM. Why would you maybe not want to use SCIM? So the spoiler alert, there just isn't really a good reason other than the standard ones. Maybe you don't need a users or groups endpoint. Maybe use just API tokens instead. Maybe you've already got a way to manage users and it's not something that you have a pressing need for, or maybe, and this is the best reason of all, maybe no one's asking for it. But beyond that, as you've heard me before, I'm almost like a shill for SCIM. I don't get paid for it. There's no organization that's paying me for it. I just really like it. It's a nice standard. It adds a lot of value. It's easy to implement. I like it, but I can totally understand if no one's asking for it, don't even bother. All right, so now let's assume that you're interested in implementing SCIM. You're ready to get started. If you're like me, you're rubbing your hands together. Let's get some code going here. However, based on my past experience, I would say you don't want to get started just yet. There's a few things you want to keep in mind first. So let's go over those. The first thing is that you want to make sure that your user store is multi-tenant. What that means is that you need to have the ability to handle some groups of users differently from others. And the reason for that is once you start using something like SCIM, you'll have a subsection of your users that are managed by someone else, not by you. So you want to be able to tell who is actually the single source of truth for this set of users. So some places will call these tenants a organization or a company or a team or a group. Whatever that meaning is, whatever that word is within your organization or within your product, you want to make sure that that is part of your user store. So in that example of the auto parts API, you want to have a way of saying, well, this franchise maybe is a mom and pop. They only add in their users, once every year. They can do it manually. Versus maybe you have a really big auto parts store and they want to be able to have people added and removed several times a week. That large auto parts store might want to use a service like Okta to manage all their users, and in which case they need to be able to send that information to your API, to that auto parts API. That's where SCIM comes in handy, but it's not going to be just one store. You're going to probably have multiple stores with different IDPs, with different identity providers, different ways of managing users, and you need to be able to know this particular SCIM request is only for this particular tenant. Another thing you want to keep in mind, and this comes from Connor, one of our developers here at Okta, he pointed out that something that people come up with a lot that they kind of run into unexpectedly is that there's no plan for how to actually add a user to a group. So there's two ways of doing that at least. One way is you could modify the user resource and say this user is now part of these 3 groups or these 4 groups. The other way of doing it would be making a modification to the group's resource. So you could say modify this group and add this one particular user to this group. Now there's no right or wrong way of doing that. It really depends on how you model users and groups on your end, but it's just something to keep in mind before you get started. Now, the thing that got me, and that I ended up, wishing I had spent a little bit more time up front knowing and learning about, was that you're going to need to be able to handle queries, so in particular, have filtered requests. So if you've got a database like a MySQL or Postgres, you have that for free. But in my case, I was using a key value store initially, and I started thinking like, oh, I can write, simulate this by writing some code, but really just so much easier just to use something like a MySQL or Postgres or a SQLite, and something that you can run a SQL query, because in that example that I just gave earlier with that Alice tester user that I added, that maps directly to a SQL query, which would be basically select star from users where username equals Alice tester. Not only that, but there's a couple other things you want to keep in mind. So again, from our Okta engineer, something you want to do is when you're paginating, when you're returning a list of user information or group information, if you've got thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users, you're not going to want to return one big result with 100,000 users. You're going to want to return 100 at a time, 1,000 at a time. It's up to you how that gets paginated. What you do want to do, though, is return all of that user information or that group information in terms of time created, so that if it's taking minutes or hours to synchronize all that information, by the time you get to the very end of all that, those lists of objects, the ones that have been added recently will be there in those last few results. This is why I recommend not using UUID, why I recommend using XID instead, because XID has the characteristics of a UUID where you can be guaranteed that they're unique, but they also have the neat property of being able to just, they will automatically sort each other. So you can just say, in your mapping to a SQL query, you can say select star from users, order by user ID, and you'll get this ability to have the stuff ordered in terms of time created. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of how you store your data seems pretty obvious in retrospect, but Connor also pointed out that you're going to want to have indexes on your attributes like username, email, last modified, things that you're going to be filtering against. Otherwise, it might take minutes to return a response to something that should be in a sub-second response time. You'll also want to figure out what attributes you need. Not super important. I recommend starting out with just the bare minimum of what you're going to need to get started. But if your application needs something like the cost center or the employee ID or the department name, and you can't operate without that, want to make sure that you plan for that up front so that you can have that be part of your integration, and you can work with Okta to make sure that your application, if you're adding it to the Okta integration network, has those attributes available so that Okta admins can then map that information into your application so that they don't have to do as much work as they would otherwise. Then lastly, of course, you're going to want to get up to speed on run scope and on ngrok, but not to worry, I'm going to be covering that in this talk. So let's get to it. Let's talk about how you would actually implement SCIM. So what I'm going to be doing here is going through doing a little demo of implementing just enough of the SCIM spec to pass Okta's run scope tests. It's actually tall order. I'm going to just pass one or two of the run scope tests. Doing more than that would take a little bit more time. And then the tools that I'm going to be using are what you see here on the screen. I'm going to be using Python and Emacs, as well as RunScope and ngrok. So let's get started. All right, here. Now I'm going to open up RunScope. So I've just gotten RunScope set up. I'm not going to walk you through how to do all that, although if you do need some step-by-step guides, this document here, Test Your SCIM API, is going to have all the instructions you need step by step for doing all that. I've done it enough times already that I kind of know what I need to do, so I'm just going to go through and do that now. So first I need to save the JSON file that has all of the tests in them. I'm going to browse to that location, import those tests. I'm going to go over to that test here, and you can see here all the various tests that are going to be running. But before I can get this set up here, I'm going to need to define a few bits of information that I'm going to need. So I'm going to put in my SCIM base URL as well as my authentication information. And of course, for authentication, normally you're going to want to support either an OAuth to bearer token or an authorization header. Normally, I'd really recommend you implement some secure functionality there, but this is a quick demo, so don't do as I do, do as I say. And we're going to need a URL. So the URL that we're going to put in here, I'm going to set up another version of ngrok. Ngrok is nice that it gives you all these examples. So I'm going to set up a tunnel with ngrok for HTTP. I'm going to make a subdomain. I think I'll call it skim guide. And it's going to be going to port 8080. Don't have anything running on that port yet, but this is enough for me to get this URL here. So you'll notice I'm using a paid plan. So the nice benefit of the paid plan is I can get these static names that are reserved. You can use the free plan, but you'll just get a random URL, and it changes whenever you close ngrok. So it's definitely convenient to pay for ngrok. Definitely worth it for me. Once I have those set up, I have another step I got to do here. I got to open up this initial script spec. This is just some JavaScript that ngrok is going to run, not ngrok, runscope is going to run. And then I've noticed I have to hit enter at the very end of this editor here to get this save button to turn on. And hit save. And we're almost ready. The last thing I want to do is change these times here to be half a second instead of 5 seconds. And it's just set to 5 seconds by default because some people that implement it have to work with really slow databases, and so they need some time for information to get saved. But since I'm controlling everything here and I'm using SQLite, it's all really fast. So I'm just going to change it to 0.5 seconds. Hit save there, and then I'm going to hit run. Now you'll see here the test gets queued up, starts running. I'll click over here and you'll see, oh man, I'm already getting some red values here. So I'm just going to hit cancel because things aren't working. Well, let's go and start fixing that. So I've got a couple of bits of code that are written already, but I'm going to write it again. So I'm just going to take that out here of my little example application. But before I do that, I'm just going to walk you through some of the code that I've got here already. It's all pretty standard stuff. So I'm importing some general libraries. This one's for interacting with the operating system. This one's for doing regular expressions. This one's for parsing URLs. I've got the XID library for generating those nice user IDs. I'm using Flask as my web framework. So I've imported stuff for Flask. SQL Alchemy is the ORM that I'm using to integrate with SQLite. And then just a few other little things for other stuff I need to get this code working. Got a little bit of setup, telling it what the name of my user database is, just getting things set up. And then I've written out these helper functions here, these helper classes. So this one here helps me return the result that skim would expect for a list of resources. So generally, when you're returning a list, you also want to tell skim, the skim client, these are how many total results we've had, and here's where we are in that result list. Just it's nice for pagination. Here's my user class. This user object is I have these definitions here that SQL Alchemy uses to define the rows and columns inside of the user's database, the user table in my database. I've got some basic stuff around setting up XID for new users. I'm figuring out what the name of the tenant should be based on the URL of the request. I've got some little helper functions here to convert data types between each other. I've also got a way to return a nice looking skim resource. So this has everything that a skim request would expect, but I make it so that I just don't have to copy and paste code a bunch. There's also a helper function here that returns a JSONified version of a skim resource, a nice way of returning an error message, and then a little bit of other helper stuff to get the database set up if it's not set up already. Well, since I don't have anything written out here, I just get started with that. So I'm going to do start setting up a route, and the route I'm going to want is this user's route here. So for that, I'm going to need to be able to answer skim v2 users. We'll just call this function get users. And to get a list of users, we're going to do a query against the user object. Let me just check my notes here and make sure I'm doing all of this right. Now I need to do user.query. That's what gets me my user query. And then what I'm also going to want to do is get a count of how many results are in that query. So let's do count equals query.count. And then let's also get the results. So what we found will be in query.all, I believe. And then we also can see here in run scope that we're passing over two get parameters, so a count and a start index. So count we're going to get from the request args, we're going to get the count. And if we get no count, we'll just default it to 1 and we'll set it as an integer. This we know it's always supposed to be an integer. The other one is going to be called start index and start index. These are using camel case and I'm using underscores, I think snake case to in Python. Just want to make sure I get that right. And then now I'm going to want to return a result value and a 200 error code. And so the return value is going to be a list response, and the list response is going to have what we found. The start index is going to be start index. The count is going to equal count. The I think there's one other thing here. Start index, count, total results. Results equals total results. And I think for that, oh yeah, this, I had an error there. So let's see here. This looks like it should work, but let's double check it. So what I'm going to do now is go over to my terminal and fire this up. So say I'm going to use the Flask command line tool. Example Flask routes. So if I run the Flask command and say routes, it'll show me here are the routes that it knows about. So this is what I would expect it to be. So let's run Flask run port 8080 reload. So I'm telling Flask run on port 8080, and when an update gets made to a file, reload it. And I'm just testing that by making a little trivial change. Cool, looks like it's running. So now let's do a curl command. Curl localhost 8080 skim v2 user, and looks like it's supposed to be users, and I got a 500 error. So I made a mistake somewhere. Oh, I remember. I've made this mistake before. I need to do render JSON. So I was returning just the raw list response object. I need to render it as JSON instead. And there we go. It works. Cool. Now I'm going to go back to run scope here and test, make sure it is users. Yep, it's users. So I just like seeing things go from red to green. So I'm going to run this one more time. It looks like I still have a error. I wonder why that is. Well, I can cancel this and go and take a look at ngrok, and I got a 404 on users. Oh, I bet you I set my base URL wrong in this here. So let's go and look at initial variables. Yep, sure thing. So skim v2, hit save. Go back here, take a look. Yes, the first one's green, the second one's going to turn green too. I'm going to hit cancel because I know the next one's going to fail. But actually, let's rerun this because I canceled it too soon. I believe that the next thing that's going to be run is it's going to actually do a request against a particular user endpoint directly. So let me let this run just a little bit to get more of that stuff done. I'm going to pass this thing here. So yeah, there it was doing a get on that particular user. So now we can hit cancel, and I can quickly go here and add it in, and then show you how that's done. So app route skim SCIM 2. So in Flask, you just use that syntax there to define a variable. Get user ID, and that just tells Flask that this thing here should show up as a variable in the function. And then here I'm going to try saying user equals user.query, and then the syntax for this is pretty simple, but just going to look at my little cheat sheet here, because I want to say filter by, and ID equals user ID, and I only want one response, and if that doesn't work, I want to return a skim error. Skim error and user not found, and that'll be a 404. And then otherwise, I'll return render JSON user. So we can test this again by going over to our terminal here, and let's just pick, there's no user found like that, because that's just some random stuff, but I see a user ID here, and that, I do get a user back. Great. So let's try to run this again. So here we go. We're going through it here. And you can see, wow, look at that, getting lots of green here, but of course I didn't implement everything here. So you'll see, for example, this one here, it was trying to get a particular user. It's trying to say, see if the filter works. It doesn't. But like any good TV chef, like Martha Stewart, I've got a version that works and everything's written already. So let's go here and say skim tiny, and let's double check to make sure that this has all the routes that we'd expect, and it sure does. So now if we go back to run scope and say run again, we'll get the nice green results for everything, which I don't know about you, but I certainly like to see that all of my tests are passing. Everything is working okay. So definitely recommend that you get run scope set up, because it lets you know what you need to do, but most importantly also lets you know when you're done, when you've got implemented what the bare minimum is for Okta. Once this is all green, you can, if you want to submit your app for integration with Okta, you'll need to have all these passing. There's more stuff for you to do after that, of course, but this is a great kind of alpha version way of knowing that stuff is working at the bare minimum. So this is going to finish up here. The last thing I wanted to do was talk about the cool ID format that I'm using. So my friend Jeff Lindsay told me about this cool thing called XID, and XID is sort of like a UUID. You've all seen UUIDs. They look, the gross looking 36 character string. One of the nice things about UUID is you don't have to synchronize any system. The UUID specification is built so that anybody who's making IDs, you're guaranteed that they're unique universally. At least we hope so. But for all intents and purposes, they're universal. However, they're not sortable. They're totally random. So what that means is that if I generate a UUID now, and then one in an hour, and then one an hour later, those won't get sorted into the time that they were created, which is a nice property to have. So there's various other things that will have the ability to be sorted, but one, for example, like Snowflake needs a central server to manage that. Just another thing you need to get set up. MongoID is nice, but it's 24 characters. XID is nicer, in my opinion, because it's just 20 characters. So it looks really nice. You've already seen what these look like, right? This is an XID. Looks a lot nicer than a UUID. So I just wanted to make sure that you know about that. But with that, we can go back to our run scope tests. Everything's passed. This is great. If you want to see the code that works, that'll pass all those tests, you can go to GitHub/OktaDeveloper/Okta skim beta I'm going to be updating this with the tiny skim server that just does what's needed to pass tests. If you don't see it, be sure to reach out to me. You've got all my contact info. Let me know to put it out there. All right, well, with that, let's wrap up. So before I finish up here, just a few more things I wanted to mention. One of them is a message from one of our product managers who works on our the lifecycle management type stuff. And so he told me about a spec that he's following called FastFed. And the reason why we're interested at FastFed here at Okta is because services that support both SCIM and SAML can be a little annoying to set up. There's the people who implemented those SCAMLs didn't, the people who implemented those standards didn't work together very closely. So the FastFed specification is a set of best practices, very opinionated around what you should do. And this is just going to make it a lot easier for both service providers and identity providers to integrate with each other with a minimum of fuss. So it's still in the early stages. We haven't started working on it, but it's something that we're following. Just wanted to put it on your radar so that it's something you can know about if you're going to be implementing SCIM. All the resources that I mentioned in this talk are all here in nice clickable links. So if you want to just open up the bit.ly/skim-guide, this will get you these exact slides. You can have these nice clickable links. I wanted to thank a few people as well. So I wanted to thank Randall Davies for inviting me to give this presentation, for being supportive, and for helping give feedback on this talk. I also want to thank Ryan Bradley for his feedback on the talk and his note about FastFed. I want to thank Connor Rowe, who's one of our Okta engineers. He works on the SCIM clients on side of Okta, and he also works a lot with our partners and customers on making sure that everything works the way that it expects. All the advice around best practices comes from him, except for the few things that I've run into myself, but he sees this and lives and breathes this stuff on a weekly basis, so he definitely knows that a lot more. So I appreciate all those people for all of their feedback, encouragement, and support. And then lastly, I want to thank you for watching this talk, for paying attention. I definitely want to hear from you. So if you have comments or complaints or suggestions or critiques, definitely let me know. Here's how to find me online. You can find me on Twitter, where I'm JF. You can also send me an email directly to my email address that you see on the screen, which is joel.franusic@okta.com. And like any video, this would not be complete without me asking you to subscribe on Twitter, follow us on Twitter, subscribe on YouTube. Definitely a good way to keep up with everything that we do here on the Okta Developer Advocacy team. And with that, I wanted to thank you for the talk, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.